Chapter 4, Deafhood, Personal Journey, Goal, Self-Actualization. Introduction. Deaf all the same? No. Some struggle. Deaf meaning and identity. Some deaf identity wear the label proud and accept. Some deaf socialize hearing world. Some deaf push away, detest hearing world. Some sign, some none. Some use hearing aid, cochlear implant. Some refuse hearing aid, cochlear implant. Some speech, talk. Some refuse, voice off. Now, let us analyze cultural identity in a variety of deaf people, inclusive of cultural awareness stages, process of acceptance, pride to be deaf, and wear the label and identity. Identity formation. Variety of scholars assess deaf people experiences growing up, influence, connection, deaf community, stages, the deaf person's journey to find identity, achieve positive identity, deaf person, wow, long struggle, why many parents, professionals, hearing, and ignorance. Important deaf child, give to them appropriate support for the transition from deaf to hearing world. Categories of deaf identity. Typical deaf person, not one identity, or deaf all the same. 7 different categories of deaf identity. Balanced, bicultural, deaf, dominant, bicultural, hearing, dominant, bicultural, culturally separate, culturally marginal, culturally isolated, culturally captive. Balanced bicultural means deaf and hearing world transition. Socialize deaf and hearing both with a preference of none. Maybe they speak fluently. Maybe they wear a hearing aid. They tend to speak and sign fluently, but can transition back and forth. Understand speech as a requirement? No, not the case. Some deaf speak not at all and are still successful in hearing culture. Bicultural as the same. Some deaf speak fluently but are uncomfortable in hearing social settings. Deaf dominant, bicultural, meaning deaf and hearing world can transition between social circles. both deaf and hearing worlds, but prefer to sign and be with deaf culture, but still socialize with hearing, teach hearing signs, request interpreters, write notes to clarify communication, try to speak or lip read. Do not avoid hearing or hearing culture, but prefer deaf signs and deaf culture. Hearing dominant, bicultural. Meaning they can be involved in the deaf community. Example reason: live farm area, work socialization, special hobby interests, not popular in the deaf community. Examples: competitive cycling, weightlifting, etc. Culturally separate. Mean hearing, socialization limited, since frustration of hearing oppression for a long time. Prefer to avoid hearing culture, maybe search for work at a deaf institute, or alone in isolation. Visit family, finish no more. Prefer socialized deaf community, happy, satisfied. Maybe go to deaf church, join bowling league with deaf, basketball game every week, deaf club, officer deaf investment club, marry deaf person, have deaf friends. Culturally marginalized. Not involved the deaf community, not involved in the hearing world, tend to avoid for fear of communication breakdown, do not speak fluently, do not sign fluently, tend to feel marginalized. Culturally isolated. Decide not to be involved in the deaf community. Culturally captive. Finally, some deaf grow up unknowing of deaf community. Parents, school, and teachers, quote unquote, protect them, cover their eyes, keep them in the dark about the deaf community. They think themselves they are the only deaf. They do not meet deaf, have no idea about deaf opportunities, services, or ASL. Stages of cultural awareness. 5 stages: conformity, dissonance, resistance and immersion, introspection, awareness. Conformity, oppression of a group. They try to force conformity, copy, and expect change. Examples: Jewish, Black, and gay communities. Many deaf tend to grow up and conform. Limited or no access to deaf culture. Push away deaf culture. Hearing parents and teachers criticize deaf culture. and these deaf adults assimilate into the hearing world as, quote, ticket out of the deaf ghetto. Dissonance stage. Expose positive influence the deaf community, evaluate their involvement and rejection, and start to consider part of their identity as deaf community and deaf culture. Maybe meet successful deaf person with a smart mind, and they start to think differently. Examples: a deaf boss, a deaf person who runs his own company, a deaf individual with a PhD. Resistance and immersion. They decide to learn cultural identity, socialize with people in the deaf community. They become angry at their hearing parents, hearing teachers, and the hearing world. Fooled me. The hearing world they push away, finish, no more. Why? Pain, hate, and anguish. In this stage, deaf want to be as deaf as possible. Reject connection to hearing culture, such as hearing aid, speech, only communicate in ASL, only socialize with deaf friends, separate from their hearing family. Introspection. Re-examine extreme perspective in the past and realize possible to be deaf, but perspective not always positive. Realize that parents and family make mistakes, yes, but they still love me and try their best. Again, reevaluate identity issues. Plan new ways thinking, involvement in the deaf community, connection with family, and connection with the hearing world. Awareness stage. Deaf accept that they are deaf, they're satisfied, they maintain a relationship with their family, they are successful navigating hearing world, control of their life, decide for themselves what is best for them. If they choose to use speech, sign, hearing aid, cochlear implant, or none. My identity, my decision. Cochlear implants and identity formation. Notice now, cochlear implants are popular with differing opinions on their positive and negative influences. First perspective believes that hearing will improve, cochlear implants, deaf culture, and deaf community in the future will vanish. Other perspective claims propaganda of cochlear implant companies, speech professionals, it doesn't matter. Deaf think that if they hear, their hearing will not be fully restored, and the deaf will still continue to struggle with language acquisition, communication access. They will continue to have misunderstandings with family, communication breakdowns, and be ignored by hearing family members. They will experience isolation, continue to struggle with a healthy, positive identity, and it will occur that the deaf will search and find deaf culture and the deaf community and form connections. The different perspectives discuss the pathological, cultural lens, which medical model. Doctors, audiologists, speech pathologists, deaf say not a disability, does not need fixing, by perpetuating the pathological mindset that something is wrong with deaf individuals and the deaf community. Deaf tend to criticize the cochlear implant as a barrier and a struggle to form their own healthy identity. Signing tends to be prohibited with cochlear implantees after a cochlear implant surgery. Doctors and professionals require the deaf child is involved in a signing-free environment, and the expectation is that parents will not sign with their child and focus on speech and listening instead. Sign, does it hurt cochlear implantees? The answer is no. It's the opposite. Research shows that sign helps all deaf children, including cochlear implantees, and children that are hearing as well. It also includes a complicated discussion about many deaf adults who decide to be implanted later in life with cochlear implants. It shows the many different ways that deaf utilize cochlear implants and technology. Most deaf adults do not want to disconnect with the deaf community. Do they think they are superior because they can hear now? No. But maybe they want to listen to music. Maybe they want an easier communication process with hearing people. Or maybe they want to hear and recognize sound. Still, deaf culture, involvement, enjoyment, and communication access to information, healthy identity formation, and etc. is all a huge part of deaf culture. Possibly, deaf adult cochlear implantees can have a conversation with hearing parents who are trying to decide whether or not to implant their deaf child with a cochlear implant. A conversation about positives and negatives of cochlear implants are needed with these parents. In conclusion, the variety of research still recognizes proof that bicultural identity is by far the best for deaf people. Deaf must orient their life or culture with separate identities to show their positive life experience and outlook. However, first they must resolve their anger and resentment towards the hearing world and their hearing families, teachers, and colleagues. For example, some deaf, their family, they disconnect with. And the reason is because the family refuses constantly and consistently to learn sign, to hire an interpreter for social gatherings with the family, and disconnecting and ignoring their family is preferable than staying and letting that resentment continue to grow and be aggravated at their family with their lack of effort to either learn sign or provide communication access. The goal of Deafhood identity is a healthy identity. It's a constant and momentous struggle to accept the deaf must search and find role models that cause the oppression to finish and to free the deaf community access. Now they can understand the lack of hearing doesn't matter. All of me, I am human. Accept and celebrate self and self-identity. Be proud of deafness. Be finished, sad, grief over hearing loss. This perspective shift with deaf life, sadness, losing hearing, now shifts to culture being all-inclusive, and many deaf lead a satisfying, happy life.